Hey guys, welcome back to Cyber Platter. Today we'll discuss interview questions and answers related to vulnerability management. First question is, what is vulnerability management? Vulnerability management is a systematic approach to identifying, evaluating, prioritizing, and mitigating security vulnerabilities in software, hardware, and systems within an organization's network or infrastructure. The goal of vulnerability management is to minimize the potential impact of security threats by proactively identifying weaknesses and taking appropriate actions to prevent exploitation. This entire process typically involves several key steps. Let's see what are those. So, first step is discovery. This is identifying all the assets, systems, and applications within an organization's environment that could be vulnerable to security threats. Next is vulnerability assessment. This is conducting scans or assessments to identify known vulnerabilities in the identified assets. This can involve using automated tools such as vulnerability scanners to identify weaknesses. Next is prioritization. This is evaluating the identified vulnerabilities based on their severity, potential impact, and likelihood of exploitation. This helps in determining which vulnerabilities need immediate attention. Next step is risk assessment. This is assessing the potential risks associated with the identified vulnerabilities and considering the potential consequences of an exploitation. Next is remediation. This is applying appropriate measures to address the identified vulnerabilities. This can include applying patches, configuration changes, or implementing compensating controls. Next step is verification. This is confirming that the remediation actions have been successful and that the vulnerabilities have been properly addressed. Next step is continuous monitoring, regularly reviewing and assessing the environment for new vulnerabilities and changes that could reintroduce vulnerabilities. Next step is reporting. Reporting is providing detailed reports and summaries of the vulnerability assessment findings, remediation efforts, and ongoing vulnerability status to relevant stakeholders. Remember that vulnerability management is an ongoing and cyclic process that aims to reduce the organization's attack surface, enhance security posture, and minimize the risk of security breaches by effectively managing and mitigating vulnerabilities. Let's move on to the next question. Define the difference between a vulnerability and an exploit. First, we will talk about vulnerability. A vulnerability refers to a weakness or flaw in a software application, system, network, or any technology component that could be exploited by attackers to compromise the security of the system. Vulnerabilities can exist due to errors in design, coding, configuration, or other factors. They represent potential entry points for malicious actors to gain unauthorized access, disrupt services, steal data, or perform other malicious activities. Examples of vulnerabilities can be software bugs, misconfigurations, weak passwords, and insecure network protocol. Now, let's see what is an exploit. An exploit, on the other hand, is a specific piece of code or technique that takes advantage of a vulnerability to compromise a system, gain unauthorized access, or perform malicious actions. Exploits are used by attackers to leverage the weaknesses identified in vulnerabilities. When an attacker successfully employs an exploit, they can breach the security defense of a target system, allowing them to carry out actions that were not intended by the system's designers or administrators. Exploits can be developed by malicious actors or security researchers to demonstrate the existence and severity of vulnerabilities. So, in simple terms, a vulnerability is like an unlocked door or an open window in a building, while an exploit is the tool or method that someone uses to get through that unlocked door or window. The vulnerability is the weakness that could potentially be exploited, and the exploit is what actually takes advantage of that weakness to achieve a specific outcome, often detrimental to the system's security or functionality. Let's use a common example to see the difference between vulnerability and an exploit. Imagine there is a web application that has a vulnerability related to input validation. The application doesn't properly validate user input before processing it, which means that a malicious user could inject malicious code into the input fields, potentially leading to a security breach. This vulnerability exists due to programming error that allows user supplied data to be executed as code. Now, an attacker discovers the input validation vulnerability in this web application and develops a piece of code called an exploit that can take advantage of this weakness. The exploit contains specifically crafted input that, when sent to the vulnerable application, tricks it into executing the malicious code. This could lead to the attacker gaining unauthorized access to the application's database, stealing sensitive information, or causing the application to malfunction. In this scenario, the vulnerability is the flaw in the application's input validation process that allows user input to be executed as code. The exploit is the malicious code or technique that an attacker uses to manipulate the vulnerable input validation and achieve their malicious goals. Now let's go to the next question. Explain the concept of CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System. CVSS is a standardized framework used to assess and communicate the severity and impact of security vulnerabilities. CVS provides a way to objectively evaluate the characteristics of vulnerabilities and assign a numerical score that reflects their potential risk to systems and organizations. This scoring system helps security professionals, administrators, and developers prioritize their efforts when addressing vulnerabilities. CVS operates on a numeric scale, typically ranging from 0 to 10, where higher scores indicate higher severity. That is, 10 indicates the highest severity. CVSS score is composed of three metric groups. The first one is base metrics. These metrics represent the intrinsic characteristics of a vulnerability and assess the potential impact of an exploit without considering any additional factors or mitigations. Base metrics include attack vectors. These describe how an attacker would need to interact with the target system, example, local, adjacent network, or remote. Then attack complexity. This describes the level of complexity required for an attacker to exploit the vulnerability. Then there is privileges required. This indicates the level of privileges an attacker needs to exploit the vulnerability. Then there is user interaction, that is UI. This indicates whether the attacker requires user interaction to exploit the vulnerability. Then there is scope. This specifies whether the vulnerability affects only the vulnerable component or has a broader impact. Then there is CIA, that is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These metrics assess the potential impact on the affected system's confidentiality, integrity, and vulnerability. Then the next type of metrics in CVSS metric groups is temporal metrics. These metrics account for factors that can change over time and affect the severity of the vulnerabilities. These metrics include: first is exploitability. This reflects how likely the vulnerability is to be exploited. Next is remediation level. This indicates the availability of a fix or workaround. Next, we have report confidence. RC. This reflects the level of confidence in the accuracy of the vulnerability information. So the next metric in the metric group is environmental metrics. Like the name suggests, these metrics take account of the unique characteristics of the target environment. This is the environment in which the vulnerability exists. And these metrics include: first one is collateral damage potential. This reflects the potential impact on components beyond the vulnerable one. Next is target distribution. This reflects the percentage of systems that are vulnerable in the environment. Then is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These metrics assess the potential impact on the affected system's confidentiality, integrity, and availability in the specific environment. So using these metrics, CVSS calculates a base score and optionally temporal and environmental scores. The combined scores provide a comprehensive assessment of the vulnerabilities severity, considering factors like the ease of exploitation, potential impact, and the environment in which it's present. CVSS scores help organizations prioritize vulnerability remediation efforts and allocate resources effectively to address the most critical vulnerabilities first. It also aids in making informed decisions about the level of risk acceptance based on the specific context of an organization's infrastructure and security posture. Let's move to the next question. How do you prioritize vulnerabilities? First is the vulnerability scoring. Begin by assessing a score to each vulnerability and using a standardized scoring system like CVSS. This provides an initial assessment of vulnerabilities severity. Like, we did here, right? We saw how it is done. Like, you're considering the base metrics, temporal metrics, environmental metrics, and then it provides a CVSS score. This is already done here. So now let's see what next is to be considered. Consider the business impact. Evaluate how the vulnerability aligns with the organization's business goals and objectives. Prioritize vulnerabilities that directly impact critical business functions, customer data, or revenue streams. Next is asset ownership. Consider the ownership and importance of the affected assets. Prioritize vulnerabilities based on the ownership of assets by critical departments or stakeholders. Then, regulatory compliance. Identify vulnerabilities that could lead to non compliance with industry regulations, legal requirements, or data protection standards. Prioritize vulnerabilities that could result in regulatory penalties. Then is data sensitivity. Assess the sensitivity of the data that the vulnerability could expose. Prioritize vulnerabilities that could lead to unauthorized access to sensitive data. Next is user impact. Evaluate the potential impact on end users. Prioritize vulnerabilities that could affect a large number of users or result in disruptions to user experience. Then is exploitation complexity. Consider the complexity required to exploit the vulnerability. Prioritize vulnerabilities that can be easily exploited as they are more likely to be targeted by attackers. Known vulnerability management. Prioritize vulnerabilities that align with the organization's vulnerability management policy, which may include specific guidelines for handling certain types of vulnerabilities. Then as user awareness. Consider vulnerabilities that could be mitigated through user awareness and education. Prioritize vulnerabilities that can be addressed by improving user practices. Impact on partners and customers. Assess vulnerabilities that could indirectly impact partners or customers. Prioritize vulnerabilities that could erode trust or damage business relationships. Then consider the potential long-term consequences of the vulnerability. Prioritize vulnerabilities that could have ongoing or cascading effects on the organization's security posture. Then evaluate the availability of resources required for mitigation. Prioritize vulnerabilities for which resources are readily available or can be allocated efficiently. Then prioritize vulnerabilities that align with organization's overarching security strategy. You can also consider the vulnerabilities that align with the risk management approach. Then consider the business continuity. Assess vulnerabilities that could disrupt critical business operations or affect the organization's ability to deliver products or services. Then as mitigation confidence. Prioritize vulnerabilities for which effective mitigation strategies are available and can be confidently implemented. So remember that vulnerability prioritization is not a one size fits all approach. Organizations should tailor their prioritization strategy to their specific business context, risk tolerance, and available resources. Regular reassessment and flexibility are key to maintaining an effective vulnerability management program. Let's move on to the next question. Can you name some popular vulnerability management tools? So you can consider here Nessus, Koalis, Rapid7 Expose, OpenVAS, Tenable.io, Burp Suite. Burp Suite is a web vulnerability scanner. IBM Security QRadar. And then you can also consider Tenable SC. Formerly, this was called as Security Center. Then SolarWinds Security Event Manager, Qualys Guard, WAS, that is web app. This is for web applications. Nextpost Community Edition, Insight VM. So it is good to know all these tools, even though you have not worked on them. Let's move on to the next question now. Explain the role of a vulnerability scanner in the vulnerability management process. A vulnerability scanner plays an important role in the vulnerability management process by automating and simplifying the process of identifying security vulnerabilities within an organization's systems, applications, and network infrastructure. It is a software tool designed to scan, assess the security posture of assets for potential vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and weaknesses. Let's see how now vulnerability scanner contributes to the vulnerability management process. First one is automated scanning. Vulnerability scanners automate the process of scanning large numbers of assets such as servers, workstations, databases, network devices to identify vulnerabilities. This automation saves time and resources compared to manual assessments. Then is discovery of vulnerabilities. The primary function of a scanner is to identify security vulnerabilities within scanned assets. It analyzes system configuration, services, ports, and applications to detect known vulnerabilities and potential entry points for attackers. Next is severity assessment. Scanners often provide severity ratings for identified vulnerabilities based on industry standards like CVSS. This helps organizations prioritize vulnerabilities based on their potential impact and likelihood of exploitation. Next is risk identification. By detecting vulnerabilities, scanners assist in risk identification by uncovering potential weak points that attackers can exploit. Organizations can then assess the level of risk associated with these vulnerabilities. Next is scanning of applications. Many modern vulnerability scanners also include capabilities to scan web applications and APIs for security vulnerabilities such as injection attacks, cross-site scripting, and insecure configurations. Next is network assessment. Vulnerability scanners analyze network configurations and identify potential security weaknesses that could lead to unauthorized access, data leakage, or other security breaches. Next point is continuous monitoring. Vulnerability scanners can be configured for scheduled periodic scans, allowing organizations to maintain continuous visibility into their security posture and promptly address newly discovered vulnerabilities. Then we have reporting and documentation. After a scan, vulnerability scanners generate detailed reports that include lists of identified vulnerabilities, their severity ratings, potential impacts, and recommended remediation steps. These reports are essential for decision making and documentation. Then there is integration with other tools. Many vulnerability scanners offer integrations with other security tools such as patch management systems, SIM solutions, source solutions. This allows for a more holistic approach to vulnerability management. Then there is compliance and auditing. Vulnerability scanners can help organizations meet compliance requirements by identifying vulnerabilities that violate security standards or regulatory guidelines. Next one is reducing attack surface. By identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities, organizations can significantly reduce their attack surface, making it more difficult for attackers to exploit weaknesses and gain unauthorized access. So, overall, a vulnerability scanner streamlines the vulnerability management process by providing automated, comprehensive, and actionable insights into an organization's security vulnerabilities, helping to enhance overall security posture. Let's go to the next question. How do you conduct a vulnerability assessment? Conducting a vulnerability assessment involves a systematic process of identifying, evaluating, and prioritizing security vulnerabilities within an organization's systems, applications, and network infrastructure. Let's see how it can be done step by step. First step is scope definition. Define the scope of the assessment, including the assets, systems, applications, and network segments to be assessed. Determine whether the assessment will cover external facing systems, internal facing systems, or both. Next one is asset inventory. Compile an inventory of all assets within the defined scope. This includes servers, workstations, network devices, applications, databases, and any other components. Third step is vulnerability scanning. Use vulnerability scanning tools to scan the identified assets for known vulnerabilities. These tools automate the process of identifying vulnerabilities based on their signatures, misconfigurations, and other indicators. Next is scan configuration. Configure the scanning tool according to the scope and environment. Adjust scanning settings such as scan frequency, depth, and authentication credentials to gain accurate results. Next step is scanning execution. Initiate the vulnerability scan on the selected assets. The scanning tool will systematically assess the assets for vulnerabilities, open ports, services, and potential weaknesses. Next one is vulnerability identification. Review the results of the vulnerability scan to identify and document the vulnerabilities detected. This includes assessing the severity, potential impact, and possible exploitation methods of each vulnerability. Next one is false positive verification. Validate the identified vulnerabilities to eliminate false positives. This involves manually verifying whether the vulnerabilities reported by the scanning tool are indeed present. Next is vulnerability prioritization. Prioritize vulnerabilities based on their severity, potential impact, and relevance to the organization's environment. Consider factors like exploitability, asset criticality, and business impact. Next step is risk assessment. Evaluate the risks associated with each prioritized vulnerability. Assess the likelihood of exploitation, potential consequences, and the existing security controls that mitigate the risks. Next one is remediation planning. Develop a remediation plan that outlines the steps required to address the identified vulnerabilities. Specify actions, responsible parties, timelines, and any required resources. Next is remediation execution. Implement the remediation plan by applying patches, updates, configuration changes, or other mitigation measures. Ensure proper testing before deploying the changes to production environments. Next step is to rescan and validation. Conduct a follow-up vulnerability scan to verify that the identified vulnerabilities have been successfully remediated. Validate that the vulnerabilities are no longer present. Next is documentation and reporting. Document the asset process, including the identified vulnerabilities, prioritization, and remediation steps. Generate comprehensive reports for different stakeholders, including technical teams and management. Next is continuous monitoring. Implement continuous monitoring to regularly assess the environment for new vulnerabilities or changes that could reintroduce vulnerabilities. Schedule periodic vulnerability assessments to maintain security hygiene. Feedback and improvement. Gather feedback from the vulnerability assessment process to refine and improve further assessments. Continuously update scanning tools, methodologies, and processes based on lessons learned. So this is almost same as the key steps that we discussed about vulnerability management in the first question, but it has a little bit in-depth explanation here. So, conducting a vulnerability assessment is an iterative process that requires collaboration among security teams, IT administrators, and other relevant stakeholders. Regular assessments are essential to maintain a strong security posture and proactively address potential security risks. Let's move on to the next question now. What is the difference between active and passive vulnerability scanning? Active and passive vulnerability scanning are two different approaches to identifying security vulnerabilities within an organization's systems and network infrastructure. Each approach has its own benefits and considerations. Let's see the difference. First, we will talk about active vulnerability scanning. This involves actively probing and interacting with systems systems to identify vulnerabilities. This approach requires the scanning tool to send network packets, perform tests, and simulate attacks to detect potential weaknesses. Active scanning is more intrusive and can disrupt normal system operations, making it important to exercise caution when conducting scans. Active scanning can provide more accurate results as it is directly testing the system's response to potential attacks. Active scanning is typically faster than the passive scanning as it directly interacts with systems to gather information. Now, let's see what is passive vulnerability scanning. Passive vulnerability scanning involves monitoring network traffic and system behaviors to identify vulnerabilities without directly interacting with systems. So active, you're directly interacting with the system. Passive, you are not directly interacting with the system. Passive scanning analyzes network traffic, looking for patterns, behaviors, and indicators of vulnerabilities without sending probing packets. Passive scanning does not disrupt systems or applications being assessed, making it suitable for environments where disruptions are a concern. Passive scanning provides ongoing monitoring of network activity, allowing detection of vulnerabilities as they emerge. These may not identify vulnerabilities that do not generate observable network traffic or behaviors. They may also not provide real time results, and there could be a delay between the vulnerability's emergency and its detection. Now, how do we choose between active and passive scanning? First thing we need to consider here is the use case. Active scanning is suitable for scheduled vulnerability assessments where immediate results are necessary. Passive scanning is beneficial for continuous monitoring and detecting vulnerabilities as they appear. Next one is impact consideration. If system disruption is a concern, passive scanning is a better option. Active scanning should be conducted during maintenance windows or with proper approvals. Next is speed versus continuity. Active scanning is faster and ideal for point in time assessments, while passive scanning provides ongoing visibility into vulnerabilities. Next one is accuracy. Active scanning provides more accurate results due to direct testing, while passive scanning relies on observed behaviors. Next one is resource utilization. Active scanning consumes more network and system resources compared to passive scanning. So, in practice, organizations often use a combination of active and passive scanning to achieve a comprehensive view of their security posture. Active scanning is employed for periodic assessments, while passive scanning provides continuous monitoring for emerging threats and vulnerabilities. Let's move on to the next question. What is a zero-day vulnerability and how is it managed? A zero-day vulnerability refers to a security vulnerability in a software application, operating system, or hardware device that is actively being exploited by cyber criminals or threat actors before the vendor or developer has released a patch or fixed for it. The term zero day signifies that the vulnerability is exploited on the same day it is discovered, with 0 days of protection against attacks. The vendor or developer of the affected software is unaware of the vulnerability's existence before attacks occur. Since the vendor is unaware, there is no official patch or fix available to address the zero-day vulnerability. Zero-day vulnerabilities are considered high risk because attackers are already leveraging them and users have no immediate defense. Attackers usually move quickly to exploit zero-day vulnerabilities, making traditional defenses less effective. So, managing zero-day vulnerabilities requires a proactive and multifaceted approach to reduce the risks and impact of attacks. Let's see some of the key steps in this effort. First one is security monitoring and threat intelligence. Employ advanced threat intelligence services and security monitoring to detect early signs of zero-day attacks. Stay updated on emerging threats and vulnerabilities through industry sources, security advisories, and partnerships. Next one is segmentation and isolation. Implement network segmentation to limit the potential spread of attacks. Isolate critical systems and sensitive data from other parts of the network to contain potential breaches. Next one is IDS and IPS. that is intrusion detection and prevention systems, use these systems to identify and block attacks targeting zero-day vulnerabilities. IDS IPS can detect attack patterns and behaviors indicative of unknown threats. Next is application whitelisting. Employ application whitelisting to allow only approved software to run on systems. This helps prevent the execution of malicious code associated with zero-day exploits. Next one is behavioral analysis. Implement behavioral analysis tools to monitor system activities for unusual behaviors or patterns that may indicate the presence of zero-day attacks. Next is patch management strategies. Work with software vendors to expedite the release of patches or workarounds for zero-day vulnerabilities. Patch management becomes crucial once a fix is available. Next is vendor communication. Establish communication channels with software vendors to report and share information about zero-day vulnerabilities responsibly. Next is security awareness and training. Educate employees about the risks of zero-day attacks and social engineering techniques that often accompany them. Next is develop and maintain emergency response plan specifically tailored to zero-day vulnerabilities. This plan should outline steps to detect, mitigate, and recover from zero-day attacks. Next is threat hunting. Proactively search for signs of compromise within the network using threat hunting techniques, aiming to identify potential zero-day attacks. Next is cyber insurance. Consider cyber insurance to mitigate potential financial losses resulting from zero-day attacks. So, zero-day vulnerabilities pose a significant challenge due to their stealthy and immediate exploitation by attackers. Organizations must adopt a comprehensive cybersecurity strategy that combines prevention, detection, response, and collaboration to effectively manage these vulnerabilities and minimize their impact. The next question is, what steps should be taken if a vulnerability is exploited before it is patched? So, if a vulnerability is exploited before it is patched, it's essential to respond swiftly and effectively to contain the breach, mitigate the impact, and prevent further compromise. So, first, you isolate the affected system. Immediately isolate the compromised systems from the network to prevent further spread of the attack and limit the attacker's access to other parts of the environment. Next is invoke the IR plan. IR is nothing but incident response plan. There's a separate video where I talk about incident response entirely. I will link it in the description box if you want to go through it. So here we activate our organization's incident response plan to ensure a coordinated and structured response, assign roles and responsibilities to the incident response team. Next step is containment. Contain the breach by identifying the extent of the compromise and taking steps to prevent the attacker from moving laterally within the network. Next is preserve evidence. This evidence is related to the attack for forensic analysis. This evidence may be crucial for understanding the attacker's origin, methods, and impact. Next one is communication. Inform relevant stakeholders, including senior management, legal counsel, public relations, and affected customers about the breach. Ensure transparent and timely communication. Next is remediation. Develop a plan to remediate the exploited vulnerability. This may involve deploying emergency patches, implementing workarounds, or applying configurations to prevent further exploitation. Next is forensic analysis. Conduct a thorough forensic analysis to understand how the attacker gained access, what data was compromised, and the extent of the damage. Next is incident eradication. Completely remove the attacker's presence from the affected systems. This may involve rebuilding affected servers or restoring from known good backups. Next is password resets. Reset passwords for compromised accounts and systems to prevent attacker from maintaining access. Next is security auditing. Conduct a security audit to identify any other vulnerabilities or weaknesses that could have contributed to the successful attack. Next is patch management. Apply patches and updates to the affected systems to address the vulnerability that was exploited. Prioritize this step to prevent similar future incidents. Next is monitoring and detection. Enhance monitoring and detection capabilities to identify any signs of reinfection or new compromise attempts. Next is review and learn. Conduct a post incident review to analyze the incident response process, identify areas for improvement, and learn from the experience. Next step is regulatory and legal obligations. Comply with any legal or regulatory obligations related to the data breach reporting and notification. Last step is continuous improvement. Incorporate the lessons learned from the incident into your organization security practices and policies to prevent similar incidents in the future. So, responding to a vulnerability that has been exploited requires a well prepared incident response plan, a skilled incident response team, and clear communication among all stakeholders. The goal is to minimize impact of the breach, restore normal operations, and strengthen the organization security posture moving forward. So I highly recommend to go through the incident response video that is linked in the description box. Next question is, how can organizations address supply chain vulnerabilities in their vulnerability management program? Addressing supply chain vulnerabilities is crucial to maintaining a comprehensive vulnerability management program, as these vulnerabilities can be exploited to compromise an organization's system and data. Some of the key points to consider here are: the first one is the vendor risk assessment. Conduct a thorough evaluation of third party vendor security practices, vulnerability management processes, incident response capabilities before partnering with them. Next is vendor security contracts. Define clear security expectations and responsibilities in vendor contracts, ensuring that vendors commit to timely patching, vulnerability disclosure, and compliance with security standards. Next is continuous monitoring. Implement ongoing monitoring of third party vendors to detect vulnerabilities, security weaknesses, and potential threats in real time. Next, secure development practices. Encourage vendors to adopt secure software development practices to minimize the introduction of vulnerabilities during the development lifecycle. Next is incident response plan. Develop a robust incident response plan that includes procedures for addressing and mitigating supply chain related security breaches promptly and effectively. Next is asset inventory. Maintain an inventory of all third party software components and services used within your organization's infrastructure. This helps identify potential vulnerabilities. Next is patch management agreement. Define expectations for timely patching and update in vendor contracts. Ensure that vendors promptly address known vulnerabilities in their products. Next one is redundancy and backup. Develop redundancy and backup strategies to minimize the impact of a supply chain breach. Ensure that critical systems have alternative options if a vendor becomes compromised. So, addressing supply chain vulnerabilities requires a multi pronged approach that involves collaboration, monitoring, clear expectations, and proactive risk management. Addressing supply chain vulnerabilities requires an approach that involves collaboration, monitoring, clear expectations, and proactive risk management. By incorporating supply chain security into your overall vulnerability management program, you can significantly reduce the risk of supply chain related breaches. Now, let's go to the next question. What are some challenges in maintaining an up to date vulnerability management program? Maintaining an up to date vulnerability management program can be challenging due to various factors that impact the effectiveness of the program. Let's see some of the common challenges that organizations face. First problem is proliferation of assets. Organizations often have a large and constantly changing number of assets, including servers, workstations, applications, and IoT devices. Keeping track of all these assets and their vulnerabilities can be daunting. Next is complexity of IT environments. Modern IT environments can be complex with hybrid cloud setups, virtualized systems, remote devices, and third party integrations. Ensuring that all assets are scanned and assessed accurately across different environments can be a challenge. Third one is lack of assets visibility. Inadequate visibility into all assets within an organization's network can lead to gaps in vulnerability identification. Assets that are not properly inventoried might be overlooked during scans. Fourth one is prioritization dilemma. Identifying and prioritizing vulnerabilities based on severity and potential impact requires careful assessment. Limited resources may lead to difficulties in deciding which vulnerabilities to address first. Next is patch management challenges. Applying patches to vulnerabilities in a timely and efficient manner can be challenging. Some vulnerabilities may require significant testing before deployment to prevent disruptions. Next challenge is false positives. Vulnerability scanning tools can sometimes generate false positive results, flagging vulnerabilities that don't actually exist. This can lead to wasted time and resources investigating non existent issues. Next is patch compatibility. Incompatibility issues between patches and existing software or systems can hinder the patching process. Testing compatibility and ensuring a smooth deployment is crucial. Next challenge can be resource constraints. Limited budget, staffing, and tools can impact the frequency and effectiveness of vulnerability assessments and remediation efforts. Next is vendor response time. Organizations depend on vendors to provide patches for vulnerabilities. Delays in vendor responses or patch releases can leave systems exposed to threats. Next one is zero-day vulnerabilities pose a unique challenge as they are exploited before patches are available. Mitigating these vulnerabilities requires a different approach. Next one is user training and awareness. End users can unknowingly introduce vulnerabilities through actions like clicking on malicious links or downloading unauthorized software. Educating users about security best practices is essential. Next is integration with DevOps. In agile development environments, integrating vulnerability management into the DevOps process without hindering development speed can be complex. Next one is legacy systems. Older systems or software might be difficult to patch or update due to compatibility issues or lack of support from vendors. Next is regulatory compliance. Meeting regulatory requirements for vulnerability management can add complexity and urgency to the process. Next one is continuous monitoring. Ensuring continuous monitoring for new vulnerabilities and maintaining an up to date view of the threat landscape requires dedicated resources. So, to overcome these challenges, organizations need to adopt a proactive approach that includes robust processes, efficient tools, collaboration between IT and security teams, and a clear understanding of their specific environment and risk profile. Regular assessments, training, and ongoing improvement are essential for maintaining an effective and up to date vulnerability management program. So that's it for today, guys. I hope this video helped you understand a little bit about vulnerability management and the potential questions that can be asked in the interview. If you like today's video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our videos. I will see you in another video with another topic. Until then, bye bye.